On.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Let's Talk Regen Ag. We're so grateful that you've joined us this evening. And before I introduce our amazing panel, I first want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am tonight, which is the Ngayinbal Bundjalung Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that injustice of stolen land continues today. For wherever you are, we hope you're doing okay during lockdown. And I'm so excited about this evening because we are kicking off our review of the New South Wales Greens agriculture policy. And we've got some really incredible people tonight that are going to be sharing with us their insights and where we think that the Greens need to go. Just some housekeeping to start off with. So we want to have as much time for you to ask questions, but we've got 30 minutes of presentation, pretty dynamic, and we'll keep that moving. And then we've got question time. So if you have questions, can you put them in the chat and can you direct them to a specific panelist? And I will try and get as many questions answered in the second half as possible. You feel free to chat about anything through the chat. And also, we want to continue the conversation. So if you don't get your question asked, please just email us. Jackie's going to drop into the chat our email, and please just continue the conversation beyond. Before I introduce everyone, I just want to say that this is an incredible opportunity that we have to not just set the agenda, but also to deliver results for the planet. Dr. Dara Tatre has a PhD in the deep ecology movement, and she's been doing a lot of research, deep research, into the movement worldwide and also the challenge before us. And she's going to set the scene. Then we're going to hear from Adam Gibson, who's the founder of Venture Organics, and he's going to talk to us about the emergence of regenerative agriculture and opportunities for farmers. And then we're hearing from mushroom farmer and the co-founder of Young Farmers Connect, Joel Orchard. And he's coming from where he's breeding crickets, I believe, tonight. And he's going to talk to us about social sustainability and small-scale farming. And then last but not least, we have Sue Higginson, former CEO of the Environmental Defenders Office and a dry rice farmer herself. And she's going to be talking about why the Greens and breaking down the political boundaries that are preventing us from more sustainable practices on planet Earth. So have a good night, and let's sit back and hear from our panellists. Over to you, Dara. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. It's good to be speaking with you about agriculture policy from Gundungurra country in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. The significance of the agriculture sector was one of the big takeaways from the 2019 IPCC report on climate change and land. A crisis was then declared in the next major report, Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis. It's truly sobering to think, unfortunately, we have already wasted over a half a century by not listening to Rachel Carson about pesticides in 1962 or to the limits to growth in 1972. In the main, we did not take the recommended actions to establish a sustainable civilization. There are, of course, multiple signs of change, with great work being done in communities, in research, and on farms around the world. Amidst all the dire warnings, lots of possibilities as well. In 2016, a UN Environment Programme report estimated that the agricultural sector could be largely carbon neutral by 2030 if systems proven to reduce emissions from agriculture were widely adopted today. If they were widely adopted today. No other force has shaped the Earth's surface as much as agriculture. So it stands to reason that one of the most effective places to intervene in the climate crisis would be right there, Food, land use, and agricultural practices represent around 24% of human-induced climate change on croplands and pastures covering 35 to 40% of the Earth's ice-free land surface. The impact is roughly equivalent to that of electricity generation, which is quite a surprising fact. Consequently, improving land use and food systems could dramatically reduce 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and remove significant amounts of already emitted carbon dioxide. This would buy us a lot of time, which is in short supply. Capturing and storing excess atmospheric carbon will give time for new carbon neutral technologies and practices to replace fossil fuels and for other changes to take effect. Regenerative farming and grazing was first raised in the Australian Parliament in 2008 by Ian Cohen. It's now at the forefront of a range of nature-based agroecology practices being promoted by the world's soil scientists. And it's not just scientists and farmers who are interested. A Regen Ag search on Forbes.com last month yielded 144 results, including Beyond Sustainability, the regenerative business, in which the author stated, by co-building a carbon-negative regenerative economy, US manufacturers can potentially unlock 26 trillion in financial value and produce over 65 million new green jobs globally by 2030. Coffee, cheese, chocolate, bourbon, rice, coconut water, cosmetics, poultry, beef, and money are some of the products mentioned in connection with Regen Ag. Lots of people and lots of investment funds are very excited about the healthy returns from socially responsible regenerative agriculture. The European Commission has taken on board a systems-based approach in its How to Transform Food Systems, emphasizing the indivisibility of ecological, health, social, and economic goals. This fits in beautifully with the 4 pillars of the New South Wales Greens. Based on evidence, ethics, and public interest, our policy should aim to have the New South Wales agriculture sector carbon neutral by 2030 in order to meet Sustainable Development Goal 2.4, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and help maintain ecosystems that strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change. A good agriculture policy could help achieve the following: drastically reduce and sequester greenhouse gas emissions in the sector, protect soils, empower farmers, promote animal welfare, and prioritize biodiversity, reduce food waste, which alone is responsible for around 1/3 of adverse effects in the agriculture sector. In fact, reducing food waste would alone save around 1/3 of water expenditure in agriculture. We could set science-based targets for going completely insecticide-free by 2030. Ditto the phasing out of nitrogen fertilizers. Synthetic nitrogen destroys organic matter in the soil and creates fish-killing dead zones. Nitrous oxide causes global warming 298 times faster than does carbon dioxide. Our policy could adopt a portfolio of nature-based solutions, including rotational, regenerative land practices that eliminate most, if not all, need for synthetic nitrogen. We should call upon all stakeholders to switch to true cost accounting, which will level the playing field currently disadvantaging healthy practices, and call upon government to direct public sector finance towards ecologically beneficial forms of farming and grazing, instead of favouring environmental vandalism. Taxpayers should not be paying to destroy the ground at their feet. In 2017, an OECD report estimated up to 100 billion US a year in subsidies worldwide to agricultural practices widely considered to be harmful. That can't be considered sane. Climate neutral technologies will, of course, certainly play a major part of the solution. But that is not what the present government means by its technology-led response. Climate change is not a problem for which there is a purely technical solution, no matter how green the technology. It requires a change in behaviour amounting to a significant shift. As Garrett Hardin pointed out in the late 1960s, merely applying more technology will only serve to worsen the situation. Urgently required are sound roadmaps to climate neutrality in the agriculture sector and great awareness raising campaigns to combat misinformation, which will be rife. Finally, a good agriculture policy will echo Bob Dylan's prophetic words and pressure the government to finally heed the call and stop standing in the doorway and blocking up the hall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dara. So much for us to think about. And we certainly have a huge task. And I find it so interesting how much agriculture contributes worldwide to carbon emissions and what a difference that we can make in this space. Please keep continuing to write in the chat, and we look forward to your questions. And now I'm going to hand over to Adam Gibson. Thanks so much, Adam.
Thanks, Tamara. So I guess I'm looking at this Regen Ag space as from a business point of view, because I believe in it, but looking at the business drivers that have been influencing it and what can speed the transition towards a regenerative movement from an economic point of view. And a few random but connected thoughts. Right now in China, there's an Australian company has just contracted. They're a small company out of Townsville in North Queensland, and they've just secured a $36 million annually recurring deal with the Chinese government, so the Communist Party in China, to supply biological fertilizers and go and start implementing biological fertilizers and regenerative agriculture on Chinese cropping land at the rate of 20 million acres per year for the next 5 years. And that company has been successful in achieving that for the reason that the Chinese government isn't necessarily interested in climate change, but the driver that has prompted that, has had them go out and actually seek out solutions in this space, as opposed to going down the chemical agriculture route, is because food shortages and the lack of nutrition and quality food in China is now becoming real. And the reason for it is because the crops are starting to fail, and the food production systems are starting to fail. The industrialized food is beginning to show its cracks, and the extractive method of farming, where we just keep mining soils for nutrients with crops every year, is now starting to finally fall apart. that's anecdotal from talking to this company. I've asked them how have they got this deal across the line, and that's been the driver. That's why the Chinese government has actively gone out and sought solutions in this space. Now, whatever you think of the Chinese is irrelevant, because what's relevant in this for us is that all they have done is we're just kicking the can down the road towards that future ourselves in Australia, insofar as our agricultural methods. In China, the difference is they're ahead of us in terms of that over-industrialized agriculture, and the result is that they've got this problem that they need to now urgently fix, because it's hurting on the ground with people's access to good quality food. So that's something we should look at, is that the driver there isn't even climate. It's literally, how do we make sure this system is sustainable, that we can feed the people? Because the assumption here in Australia is, well, industrial ag is going to keep working and working. The fact is it won't. In other words, adding chemicals, extracting nutrients just is not a sustainable system. In a very real sense, unsustainable. A second factor that we might want to consider here is in the big transition, or how do we increase the uptake of regen ag, is the consumer piece. And if you think back 25 years ago or so, the emergence of organic food and how that has now become sort of popular and has a mainstream following, and it's, there's a section in Coles and Woolies, whatever, for mainstream organic food. It's now, I think it's one of the most rapid growing food sectors worldwide, or it certainly was pre-pandemic. And that is now switching. There's an awareness growing now for people and consumers to understand that it's not just about being organic, it's also about nutrient density of their food. So we're starting to ask as consumers, more and more so, not just is there chemicals in it, but is there any nutrient in it? So I want chemical free, but I also want to have stuff that doesn't have, well, it does have something worth eating in it. And that leads us to a different, in other words, and what is influencing that is the soil quality, and the quality and the life and the biology within the soil, and the carbon that's in the soil directly impacts the quality of the food that's grown in that soil, and therefore the nutrient density in the food and the vegetables and so on, and in the grains, and therefore in our bodies. So as our consumers switch onto that, and nutrient density measuring devices and their awareness and our ability to quantitatively measure the nutrient density of our food, our grain, our meat, gives us a different value equation as consumers. We can say, well, yes, I can buy this tomato here or that tomato there, but actually the value, they're different prices, but this has got 5 times more vitamin C than that tomato because of the way it was grown, then this one represents better value. So it gives us a different paradigm to think about as consumers. That, I believe personally, that's going to be one of the biggest drivers. Dollars drive a lot of decisions, and for corporates and the big retailers to start supporting the regenerative movement, food that's grown and produced in a regenerative fashion will be prioritised and given a premium over stuff that's grown in industrial methods. The other component to think about here is, and this is a little bit more so in Joel's territory, but as you'll hear from soon, but we are seeing already food shortages and supply chain challenges. I saw a video this afternoon from Hurstville in Sydney of a supermarket that's got it's about 20% stocked in fresh fruit and vegetables, right? So as our supply chains fall over and become challenged, becoming regenerative growing isn't just about necessarily big scale farming. It's about bringing, localized food production and thinking about how close we want to have our food production to us. So there's a lot of wealth and power for the people in just having access to fresh food at this point. We don't want to have to rely on supermarkets to feed us, is probably the message in this. And that extends also out to farmers that I work with. I work with a lot of farmers on the land who are looking at moving to regenerative practices. And typically it takes some sort of event or some sort of interruption in their thought process for them to make that shift. And for a lot of them now, it's becoming simply, wow, I can't order the chemicals that I was going to order to put on my property to, either to fertilize it or pesticides or so on, but particularly inputs in terms of fertilizers. what used to be an easy order that would cost them X amount and it turned up in a couple of weeks, or now is like a 6-month waiting list and it's two or three times the price in some instances. So they're instantly looking at it going, okay, well, what else can we do? And the regenerative practices are the answer. So there's a big shift towards that, which is really good news.
Thank you so much, Adam. We're going to move on with the panel, and I can already see some great questions for you. So thank you so much. And I find it fascinating that we're ready to shift, Jackie. I find it fascinating that the Prime Minister keeps holding up China as, Dara and I were talking the other day, keeps holding up China as the laggard in terms of climate change. And yet we hear from Adam 20 million acres per year investment in biological fertilizers because the industrialization of food is finally showing its ultimate end. So I just think that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Keep the questions happening, everyone. And we're now going to turn to Joel Orchard.
Thanks very much for having me. I hope I can add a little bit more, I guess, a different perspective and some insight into this whole of food systems conversation. I'll just let you know, I haven't joined you from my storage cabinet. This is, in fact, a very small scale insect protein farm. So I guess ultimately I'm a practivist at heart, and growing my own source of high nutrient protein at home in an urban setting is something that I've been exploring and has offered me a lot of interest, and certainly in helping other people to explore other forms of agriculture themselves. I also have a mushroom farm in my garage, and I sell my locally grown mushrooms to the local community through the farmers markets. And these are the kinds of small scale farming ventures that I'm engaged with the National Young Farmers Connect organisation that I've helped co-fund. And so we've got now chapters of young farmers throughout predominantly the east coast of Australia, where population density is much higher. Lots of peri-urban farms and small scale farms around regions where local farmers and consumers can easily have that direct distribution. And so I guess my real interest and passion has been in exploring how local food economies can have all of these environmental benefits by shortening the supply chain. It means a whole lot less and reduction in transportation, the cool storage and the fossil fuels that are involved with shipping goods from, Tasmania to stores in Brisbane, or whether that's even further afield. And, we hear these terrible examples of citrus being imported from California, where our own citrus farmers are having to plow in their trees. And for all of these reasons, there's these multiplier effects that the local food economy and the small scale farming sector can add benefits from an economic perspective and investing and injecting a lot of money in local economies. From an environmental perspective, and not only do we know that small scale farmers are much more effective generally in preserving biodiversity and improving soils and their microclimates around them, but it also offers the consumer a much more tangible way to engage in the way that land is being managed. And generally we find that consumers are much more engaged in the local farming communities if they can see the way that farms are being managed around them. And I really feel like that's an important part that the local food economy has to play. And beyond that, I guess, small scale farms offer a lot more employment than large scale farming is generally moving towards highly mechanized farming. We're now talking about extremely large pieces of land being managed by less and less people. And now even going into this sort of new roboticized farming methods, which, you see those pictures, pretty much farming fields of wheat that you can see from space with one giant robotic header and combine harvesters. So I'm kind of looking at the dynamic, disruptive parts of the food economy at the other end, which is the really small scale direct food. I guess sort of when I sum up my interest, it's been in looking at urban farming, peri-urban farming, these small scale farms, which generally speaking are a really great entry point for first generation farmers. So I started farming only in the last sort of 5 to 6 years and realized that as a first generation farmer, there's a whole range of young people that are moving into the sector from non-traditional farming backgrounds. And we're now seeing a wave of younger people that are leaving professional jobs in the cities and moving to regional areas and looking to engage in something which feels really nurturing and nourishing and enables them an opportunity to have a really tangible connection with nature and grow food in really meaningful ways. And one thing that I found really interesting is that for most young and first generation farmers that we work with in the Young Farmers Connect network, regenerative farming is not really an aspiration. It's almost an entry point, and there's a real firm belief for these new farmers that that is the starting point for a farming journey, and there really is no other alternative. For all of the reasons that Adam and Dara have already given, I think the impacts of the global and industrial food system are really front of mind for a lot of young people. And from my own experience and that now talking with others, young people view farming as a form of environmental activism, and it gives them something much more than, I guess, the traditional activist model, which is stopping things which feel negative, and it gives them a real positive outlet, and it feels really nourishing for them and to be involved in their community. So this idea of community resilience, and I guess in a form of theory of a change that allows young people and communities to look at adaptive economies, adaptive technologies, and adaptive presences in engaging with community. And it allows them to explore how to transition away from things which we know are no longer serving us, and to start to transition towards processes and practices which are future driven. And that's what I think is really exciting. And I think to capture all of these ideas, the terminology which really hasn't entered the Australian lexicon is this idea of agroecology, which is really well defined through the FAO, and I'm happy to provide some resources in the chat. So there's these sort of 10 pillars of agroecology, which really looks at it being beyond a practice-based idea around food production and starts to look at it more as a socio-political movement. And that's what I think is a really exciting opportunity to look at embedding and integrating these ideas into the Greens policy, and start to look at using those 10 pillars as a driving wedge for how we look at food systems, not only as a production and an agricultural focus, but as a whole of supply chain into distribution, but also into access and agency. And probably the final thing, which I think is most important to think about, is the idea of food justice, and that really good quality food, which is grown locally by farmers, which are enhancing their biodiversity, that are nurturing and regenerating the earth, needs to be available to everybody. And if that it is set at a price point which is too expensive, we're really only targeting a very small part of the consumer market. So we need to see these kinds of practices rolled out and widely available to everyone, so that everybody can afford to be a part of the change. I might just leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions later.
Perfect timing, Joel. Thank you so much. And I think the whole concept of agroecology and the 10 pillars within that are so resonant with the, not just the Greens, but you know, some people do raise concerns about regenerative agriculture's already been mainstreamed in a lot of ways. And I'm really excited about us as a party exploring agroecology, and particularly I think the First Peoples, the justice for First Peoples that underpins it, and also social justice. It's such a holistic concept. Thank you so much. And I'm tracking the questions. And our final panellist this evening is Sue Higginson. Thanks so much, Sue.
Thanks, Tamara. Thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to bring a few things home to us here in New South Wales. So I've spent sort of the better part of the last 15, 20 years actually working with farmers across New South Wales, particularly farmers who, let's say family farmers, or sort of large family farmers, small family farmers. And interestingly, where I got to meet them in my capacity as an environmental lawyer was where their farm and their farming practice and everything they've ever known has come under direct threat by our New South Wales government policy, law and mining, and whether it be coal or gas resource extraction. What's really interesting is, of course, these policies in New South Wales have disproportionately impacted family farmers. But one of the things that we have really experienced is, and I think Adam talked about sort of circuit breakers and things that can happen as a circuit breaker to traditional farming and traditional practice. Interestingly, one of those circuit breakers has very much been when a family farm or a producer's entire livelihood and life on the farm is threatened. the prioritisation of resource extraction over food production in New South Wales has been to the extreme, absolute extreme. Some of our highest quality productive farmland. And what's actually happened socially as well as environmentally is that some of these farmers have reconnected or connected for the first time with different communities and different organisations because they've been looking for representation, for help, for assistance from places that are not their traditional political support bases. Just to digress, we heard one of the most senior National Party members only a couple of months ago, Matt Canavan, come out and make very clear that really only around 5% of their National Party supporters are farmers, and that's about 2% of the Australian population. And frankly, the Nats are really not supporting those family farming interests much anymore at all. That has been my experience. So as I have been representing many farmers, whether it's been in courts or to governments to try to influence policy and to protect their farming practice, what I have found is that these people are left in the wilderness. They literally have no representation and support. The Greens actually are the natural place for us to find each other, and that's what we've been doing over the past decade as we've all stood together to fight things that threaten healthy food production or food production. What we've also found is new friendships, new relationships where we are talking about the bigger issues. So the extinction crisis, climate change. And what we've been doing in this social journey together and this environmental fight and this legal fight and this policy fight is we've been educating each other in a really important big picture way. And it's actually resulting in some remarkable changes actually in the landscape, which takes me to my next point, and that is we're doing a lot of work on the ground. We're forging new relationships. We're working out the notion of food justice together. But what we're doing is we are coming up against some of the worst agricultural policy imaginable in New South Wales alone. So I'm just going to give you one example. So as well as being an environmental lawyer, I'm a rice farmer, and I'm a dryland rice farmer in the Northern Rivers on the beautiful Richmond floodplain. Up here, we're an emerging industry. We're currently producing rain-fed rice, so dryland rice, as opposed to the only other rice that's grown in New South Wales, which is flood-irrigated rice. We know that in the Riverina, to produce rice, we're looking at a single kilo of rice takes 2,500 litres of water. We also know the UN Environment Programme has put out data saying that flooded paddy rice is responsible for 10% of the total global methane emissions, and of course methane being a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So here in the Northern Rivers, we're pushing this incredible rice industry where we are growing the highest quality, most fantastic grain, no pesticides, no flood irrigation. We're doing it rain-fed. We're currently generating 3,000 tonnes a year. We've got the capacity to develop 20,000 tonnes a year. But we actually can barely grow the industry because current New South Wales policy says that the Riverina rice growers have the full monopoly on all rice seed, rice production, rice licenses, and who can't grow rice. And at the moment, we've got this corporate agribusiness, Sunrise, who is actually holding a monopoly, and the New South Wales government endorses that monopoly. So we've been making representations to the New South Wales government through the Nats, and we've been doing this for several years now. Fortunately, there's a review happening at the moment, and hopefully I think the momentum, and we've made the case strong enough. But really, to look at the situation and the scene, we've got so many good things happening on the ground. We've got forging relationships. We've got a whole wave of incredible land carers and food producers working together for better outcomes. And yet what we have is New South Wales policy literally holding us back, putting up the most enormous barriers you can imagine. So when it does come to the family farm, where of course we know, as Joel was saying, family farmers are the most adaptable. They are the future of farming. They are the backbone of farming and agriculture, not multinational corporate agribusiness. They're completely inflexible, and they're not capable. They don't have the change and adaptation capabilities that family farms do. We're clearly the backbone of food production in New South Wales and Australia. And yet we are single-handedly being absolutely choked to the point where our expansion and the development of our industries on a smaller scale is absolutely being crippled by current government policy. So the need for the Greens right now to develop the policies that we are working on to bust through some of those choke points that are really crippling confidence, stopping investment, and of course having dire environmental consequences. No better place or time for the Greens to be developing a really good, clear agriculture policy. I'll stop there, Tamara, so we can go to questions.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Sue. And yes, incredible. It's so important to be reminded about the work that we need to do in the New South Wales Parliament in particular, that are just like, it's so bizarre to me that Adam Marshall, you know, he's talked to me privately as Agriculture Minister, that his farm withstood the drought through regenerative agriculture. And then I said, literally, I said this, I said, well, why the fuck don't you talk about it in Parliament? And it was kind of like, because it's not really a national, it's not really their base. But what we saw at Primex this year was it absolutely is farmers that are talking about, you know, what was incredible to be out there this year, and Adam was out there with us, was that farmers are the ones who are actually doing this. And I noticed that we've got Steve here and his partner who are doing that. And there's just, it literally is the environmental movement of our time is, and of course what we've heard from Sue on her farm. So Jackie, can you please bring up all of the panel, and we'll do our best with the time that we have. We are going to start, there's a question here which I think is perfectly suited for Adam. Jackie, are you able to bring us all up? No, we might be having technical difficulties.
I think you're all on now.
You're on. It's okay. You were on, the big green triangle was on.
Oh.
That's okay. We're all on. Okay, we're saying we're all on. Thanks, Aaron. Okay, you can see us all now. Excellent. So we'll start with Adam. Natalie Tierney had a question. Hi, Adam. What is the, and sorry, just in terms of time, 2 to 3 minutes, please, for your answers. Natalie says, hi, Adam, what is the reasoning behind the cost, she wrote 2 parts, and the part I'm going to ask is, are farmers in Australia finding that their land is becoming less arable? And I know you've spent some time in Roma recently. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that. A couple of farmers I spoke to in Roma who are, using Roundup at scale to do this no-till type farming to go grain. They're finding their grain crop is not just reducing, it's reducing every year in its quantity, but also the quality, the protein content is dropping. And they see the writing on the wall, and they're looking for other options. So they're actively experimenting and piloting new biological options. There's an extraction process away from chemical ag, because the risk these guys run is a big one, that if they just throw the baby out the bathwater and stop doing what they know will work and help pay their repayments on their property immediately, they could go out of business. So there is this, from big economic drivers, not to change too rapidly, but once they feel comfortable, they are starting to come across. Because the reality is, if you can get rid of all these chemical inputs, it's actually, you make more money. Once you make that transition, after that transition's done over the first couple of years, farmers can make more money because they're not having to buy chemical inputs every year, and the land starts regenerating itself, not only financially, but also obviously in the soil and the biology. So there's an economic argument for it to happen, and they're starting to see that.
And also, of course, the what was raised, and it's being raised in the chat, just about the nutrient density as well, is just such an integral part of soil health, and consumers are wanting that. The next, I'm going to put a question to Dara. Dara, what's the most startling part of your research so far, the most startling part?
Well, I suppose the most startling part is that, having read the some of the latest IPCC reports, I'm tempted to say this changes everything. But everything has a habit of not changing, as we've seen from 1972 to 2021, which is like a longitudinal study of how society in the main reacts to credible threats to survival, credible information that imminent catastrophe is upon us. We've had several wake-up calls and we have just hit the snooze button. But I do feel that now that there is a really ramping up of a huge amount of interest and research and take up so far of regen ag and other nature-based solutions. And I think this is the biggest opportunity in my lifetime to finally force the government to deal with the crisis. This is going to be like our Trojan horse, the agriculture policy.
Thank you, Dara. We love that. We're going to now put a question to Joel from Mayor Dominic King. And I'm sorry that I didn't actually acknowledge that we had the Mayor of Bellingen here. Dominic has asked, do you have any published data on jobs? And he's in particular raising issues about industrial blueberry farming down in his area. And of course, jobs, as Sue mentioned, it becomes, when you start to talk about jobs, when you start to critique industrial farming and big farm policies and practices, then what gets brought out are that it's a jobs issue. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Joel, in the context of the small farm movement and just your perspective on those kinds of answers?
Yeah, look, I think the job situation is quite complex, and I'm more than happy to have another chat with you, Dom, when we've got a bit more time to unpack it. But I guess, in a sense, I think we've seen some fairly abhorrent behaviours from the corporate and industrial food system when it comes to human rights and dignity, especially with labour forces that we're now sort of seeing having to come into Australia from other countries. I think we've seen, even through COVID, the damage that can be done to our national food distribution system when the wheels start to fall off and we're limited by the number of imported workers that we can have to come and help get our crops off in Australia. So certainly, the jobs issue, not only from an economics driver perspective, but from a food security perspective, is a really important one to unpack. I think that there is some good data around, just how many jobs per square acre kind of rationale when you look at, large scale agribusiness versus the small scale and dynamic diverse farms. But then I think also when we're talking about the multiplier effect in local food economies, we know that the local farmer down the road that sells his cabbages and corn at the markets then goes and spends his money at the local butcher and the local hairdresser, and on and on and on it goes. Whereas just as it is with the industrial food distributors, the Coles and Woolies of the world, the dollar that you spend there just evaporates and it disappears out of communities. So I think there's more of a complex issue around how economies are managed for sustainability rather than strictly just jobs. But I certainly see in your area how it is an issue with the industrial blueberry farmers.
Thank you so much, Joel. And I've got a question for Sue from Jenny Goldie, and we can also, I guess, to open it up more broadly if anyone else wants to contribute on the panel. Her question is, can we feed an ever-growing global population through regenerative agriculture, especially in light of climate change? And I know Dara will want to say something about this too, is that it actually, she was telling me a statistic the other day that we absolutely can. But Sue, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I'm brevity of terms, absolutely we can. You look at some of the UN data really about how much land it actually takes to feed, people. What we are seeing in Australia at the moment, what is it? We're sort of 427 million hectares is what we claim in Australia as agriculture land use. So that's 55% of Australia. But what we know is that 300 million of those hectares is all of that, what I call terribly unsustainable, marginalised grazing country, where we've just got sheep and cows out there in country where really we just shouldn't have sheep and cows out there. And, you know, what we also know is that 25% of all water extractions, and I know this figure's a bit abstract because, you know, without understanding the total quantities, but 25% of total water extractions are given to agriculture. Now, when you take that one scenario I gave about the Riverina rice industry and the very fact that you can grow, you know, up to 20,000 tonnes of rice with no water allocation, you start to really get things into perspective. We can absolutely feed everybody. We can absolutely feed everybody better on higher quality land where we're working with biodiversity, not against biodiversity. And in fact, we're regenerating. And that's what this industry and this movement is all about. And if given the chance, we can show it can be done.
Thank you. Did you want to, I want to ask Dara, but Adam, did you want to add anything about food density, since that's your specialty? Nutrient densities, not food density.
Yeah, like I said, I think related to that question, I think it is a little bit about how we think about farming. Can we feed the world in a current method of farming, which is big broad acre thing, as Joel was talking about? With maybe not. You know, maybe regenerative farming isn't as applicable, but can we do it by changing the model and, you know, localizing it and bringing it back down to some different, more, I guess, historically more familiar methods? Absolutely, we can completely feed ourselves. And in doing so, we are using more sustainable regenerative systems, which do increase nutrient density. Nutrient density is partly due to the distance fresh food needs to travel and the time between when we pick it and when we eat it. So if you can pick something straight out of the garden, or it's been picked 2 days ago from a grower up the road, it's very different to something that's been stuck in a container and shipped across the Pacific Ocean to get to you. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I think, yeah, rethinking the model is part of it, for sure.
And I also just really am so excited about soil health and soils, which is, you know, we could talk, that's like a whole other webinar just to talk about soils. But that was what farmers certainly have been talking to my office about, is just so much food is not grown in soil anymore, and people don't quite realise that the lack of nutrient quality of food that isn't grown in soil or is grown in soil, which, if you saw the pants down experiment that one of the universities did, which was farmers to go and bury their white dacks in the soil and see how long it took to break down. And what they found was that on a lot of farms, it didn't break down at all, because there just simply was not those microbes and the quality in the soil. Dara, did you have that statistic at hand about, I thought you were saying something about how easily we can feed people on the planet through regen?
Well, I mean, regenerative farming practices in the end will prove to be more productive and sustainable than monocropping. The current industrial model of agriculture feeds people, which isn't its main aim, by the way. Feeding people isn't its main aim. But the current industrial model of agriculture is feeding people only about 12 or 13 food substances out of hundreds that used to feed people, and hundreds, and sometimes on small farms in Asia or South America, a small plot of land will have 100 different types of plants and herbs and legumes and all sorts of things growing to feed the family. So it is a bit of a disinformation that we depend upon large-scale monocropping, which is in fact a system that is failing. It's destroying the earth, it's destroying the soil, and it's not sustainable. Now, it's going to take a while to shift and to change, and at first, healthy farms might not be so productive, but we also need to get away from the emphasis on yield. Yield isn't everything. Quality is everything, and quality is more sustainable than yield.
Thank you so much. Look, I think what we're going to do for this last 10 minutes, with the indulgence of the participants, and just to let the participants know, we've had a couple of people put in the chat that they came in late, totally fine. We've recorded the whole session, and you won't be able to necessarily see the questions, I'm not sure, but we will certainly email that out to everyone, the 170 or 180 people that registered. But I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is just to ask each panellist to just give a couple of closing remarks, and in particular, I'd love you if you could just really reinforce what you think the Greens need to do. What is the main? I always think of good campaigns about do few things, do them well. What would be our next? We're reviewing our policy. We're going to get that right, but as a political movement, where should our focus lie? Let's start with Joel.
Thank you. I think just to follow on, there was a question about the difference between, for instance, agroecology and permaculture. And I think from my observations, regenerative farming is an extraordinarily powerful tool, and it's practice-based. And something like permaculture is very principles-based, and where I see agroecology filling that nexus between the two, and it really highlights the need for culture change and an acceptance of the culture of farming the way it's always been done, and the inclusion of our traditional farming and indigenous farming technologies as well. And I think also a really important point to make is that we currently grow enough food in the world to feed absolutely everybody 1.5 times over, and yet we still have a large proportion of the world which is undernourished, and the other half of the world which is suffering from all of the health-related issues around obesity. So clearly, this is not a primary production issue. This is a wealth disparity and a food distribution issue, which is wrapped up in a commodification of some really poor practices and a really poor distribution of food. So I think we can only need to look at this really holistically, and that if we get stuck just looking at primary production, we're probably not, or we're only really just looking at the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you, Joel. Sue, what would you like to your closing remarks? Could you please give ours?
Yeah, look, I think that fundamentally what we need to do and in our Greens policy is we really need to look at what those structural legislative and policy barriers are that exist, because that's more or less we're talking about the low-hanging fruit. We need to remove those. We need to advocate strongly to get rid of them, because they're easy to get rid of. They're the cause of the injustice to the movement getting to the next step. It's already fledged off the ground. It keeps bumping up, whether it realises it advertently or not. It bumps up against these absurd barriers, and we absolutely need to be supporting those family farmers who are the ones front of line, who want access to more resources to be able to make the transition, more support, and the big one for me is absolutely supporting farmers, holding hands to protect biodiversity, to increase productivity through the protection of biodiversity. And I think for me, if the agricultural policy of the Greens has to be dealing with the extinction crisis, because it is, in so many ways, it's a big gatekeeper step to helping our pursuit of dealing with the extinction crisis.
Thank you so much. And Adam, what would you like to say?
There's probably two points here. I think particularly in terms of how the Greens can arguably have best influence in this space towards the transition towards regeneration. I think there's two things to recognise, and one is I do a lot of work with what we call next generation farmers, and they're aspiring farmers who have a almost universally have a regenerative focus, who are looking to get onto land to employ good practices to become the future of farming. They are out there in droves, and they are the future of rural communities. They're the future of our soil, and generations on the land that will arguably prevent corporate takeover ruining owning the bush. Those people need continued support because they're out there trying to make a difference. Their barrier is capital and getting access to capital to get into the rapidly growing the the price of farming is going through the roof. The price of farmland is going through the roof. It's actually, what most people don't understand is that farmland is outperforming capital city real estate prices now. So the capital growth every year is outrageous. Those people are out there, they're the workforce who don't need convincing. We don't have to try and argue with some old cocky in the bush who says, no, I'm going to spray chemicals, I've done it this way. They're out there doing it. Let's support them. And at the same time, recognise that there is institutional capital coming into this space in droves, in large amounts of capital, are looking for a home in the regenerative movement. And that isn't because they've suddenly turned into the good guys necessarily, but they are seeing the benefits. Because the sustainability in terms of, being able to feed the nation, and the food system is seen as a pretty safe investment in a very uncertain world right now. So they are seeing it strategically as a bloody good place to invest. They're also seeing natural capital and ecological goods and services are things now which are in very familiar to nearly every investment advisor, anyone in the investment space. And this encompasses carbon, and encompasses soil health, biodiversity. Those things now are becoming a valuable commodity in the market, and there is values attached to them. So the more that we can, I guess, grease the pathway for institutional capital to support next generation farmers to do good stuff on the land, the movement's already there. The wheel's already turning in that direction. To me, that feels like a good place to sort of get behind something that's already starting to work well. It's not a headline story yet.
Thank you, Adam and Dara. We're getting
well,
close.
I think that as a kind of a policy point, the Greens should be pressuring the government to sign up to and stick to very real targets. Targets are like a thermostat. Every 0.5 degrees centigrade more of global warming has a huge impact locally on fires, droughts, and floods. That's a fact. And if we want to avoid that huge impact, then we will keep our hands on the thermostat and make sure that the temperature doesn't go up too high. It's really very simple. We need to slow down growth and increase all of the good things that we've been talking about this evening.
Thank you, Dara. Well, that brings us very close to the end of our webinar tonight. I guess my closing remarks were in answer to the question about, is the New South Wales government supporting regenerative farming? The answer is no. And weirdly, they're not supporting any farmers, any small farmers, except by encouraging them to go into more debt. And I think, and that has been a travesty that I've witnessed. And as Sue was talking about over and over, is just, through the entire drought, to watch the Nationals talking about farmers in one breath, and then in the next breath only offering low interest loans, and just the lost opportunity. However, I think what Adam has said is key, that these bastards, once they see that there is money, I'm not talking about the investors, but I'm talking about the Nationals. Once they see that the worm has really turned, it'll be interesting to see what they do, because of course the big industrial farmers, the donations to these parties are closely linked to big agriculture. And I do believe that fixing agriculture can fix most things. But I do want to just finish and say thank you all for coming. We really appreciate that. We were surprised. We weren't sure that as many people are as obsessed with regenerative agriculture, and I guess really agroecology, which I think is a better way for us to move forward conceptually. But we see that there are lots of you who are really passionate and doing great things. And, we are a movement that says, that your actions locally have a huge ripple effect on the planet. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing those great things. Please thank our panel. And if you can, at home, give them a huge clap. They're all very busy people, and we're just so grateful that they've given their time tonight. And also, of course, Jackie Allen Hway in my office, who without her, we would not all be here tonight. She's done all of the hard work. And I just want to finish with a quote. It is a bit somber, but I think Greta Thunberg is, you know, we need to be reminded that the basic problem is the same everywhere. And the basic problem is that basically nothing is being done to halt or even to slow climate or ecological breakdown, despite all the beautiful words and promises. Limits to growth is a very long time ago, and that really great thinkers predicted all of these things. So it's a call to you all to keep doing what you're doing, and let's change the world and make things better for humans and all species moving forward. Thanks so much for coming. See you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.